Palace, by that stage, whatever difficulties it may have had with her over welfare policy and riots, had come to admire her. The Queen, after all, gave her the Order of Merit. There is no higher award in the honours system in the United Kingdom.
Now, 30 years on from Margaret Thatcher's resignation, she's back in the press thanks to Gillian Anderson's portrayal of her in the Netflix smash hit The Crown. But just how accurate is it? What were the similarities between the two women? What were the disagreements? Is The Crown guilty of blatant historical inaccuracies? And how does my guest, with his unique insight, rate the series? Let's find out. So, John O'Sullivan CBE is the author of The President, the Pope and the Prime Minister, the National Review's editor-at-large, and, crucially, for our conversation today, a former advisor to Lady Margaret Thatcher. Hello, John. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine, thanks, Darren. Thanks for having me.
Good. Not at all. Thank you for agreeing to do it. How's Budapest, by the way? You know, I've never been.
Oh, it's a great mistake not to have been to Budapest. I remedied that as long ago as 1971, and I've been coming here regularly, but I've been living here since 2013. So it's a wonderful city. It's a city which is absolutely dripping with history, but also with beauty. It's a genuinely beautiful city, and that's one of the reasons, why people enjoy living here. There are others. It's a very low cost of living and a very high quality of life, but for that cost of living. But of course, being surrounded by lovely buildings and a lot of other good aspects of civilization is itself a joy.
Now, John, I wonder, before we go on the attack, which I have a feeling you might, I wonder if you might tell us what you believe the similarities between the two women actually were, between Her Majesty the Queen and Margaret Thatcher. I'm thinking, of their seriousness, their work ethic, their Christianity indeed, and of course their patriotism, and being a very similar age as well. What were, in your eyes, the similarities between, or are the similarities between the two?
Well, you've mentioned, of course, many of the most important ones. People have, over the years, seen the Queen as the slave of duty. People often quote the oath she took on becoming Queen. And that oath was a personal pledge that she would devote her life to the country and its welfare. And most people would say, I think a great majority, that she has fulfilled that pledge much more than anyone could reasonably have expected when she gave it. Secondly, I think both women are very practical and pragmatic. People often think of Mrs. Thatcher as somebody who was dedicated to an ideology, and her view was, if you look at this show, let the heavens fall, in order for justice to be done, or as this series would probably say, for injustice to be done. But she wasn't like that at all. She was a very cautious person. Her political career was devoted to solving manifest problems that were sitting in front of the British people, but which had been neglected for too long. The obvious one being the power of the overmighty trade unions. Another, inflation, which was eating away at the country's long-term prosperity when she became Prime Minister. A third would be the threat from the Soviet Union in a Cold War that in the 70s had become much more serious again after years of détente. So she tackled those things, not because she had some kind of ideological blueprint. She did have a faith in liberty, but she was very practical in how she attempted to reform the country. And in a sense, she dealt with unavoidable problems. And that's important too. So now the Queen and she may have reached some different conclusions on one or two questions. That's not unusual in life. But the Queen was probably took the default position of the establishment in those years, which was that a kind of mild, beneficent social democracy was probably the right direction. I think the Thatcher years disproved that view, and the establishment's view changed, actually. But nonetheless, it was the view, and it would be very, I wouldn't expect the Queen's position to diverge wildly from that of most of the great and good in society. And I think there would have been some nervousness on her part, as there is in the film, about the sudden combination of difficulties, inflation still out of control, the measures that are going to bring it under control, nonetheless creating unemployment and a temporary recession, and in general the riots in Toxteth and elsewhere, and the general feeling that the ship was heading for the rocks. And that was very common. And those of us who didn't agree with that analysis and saw that changes were coming that would render the analysis completely false, which those changes did occur, and they rendered the analysis false. But they haven't rendered it false in the minds of the people who wrote and directed The Crown. That's their view. It's now the view of a relatively small number of people in serious politics, mainly on the left of the Labour Party, but nonetheless, it's culturally a powerful view because it enables people to feel, morally superior to everybody else, and of course to assuage their feelings of resentment that they were on the wrong side in the battle with Mrs. Thatcher.
Now, I want to explore a little bit further shortly the themes that you've just picked up on there, a couple in particular, the Soviet Union and of course the trade unions, which I think actually they skirt over and don't mention at all, and that to me is a mistake. So I'd like you to explore those in a second, but first of all, if we might be a little bit reductive to start with, what do you think stylistically about Gillian Anderson's portrayal? Is it too much of a caricature? Because Anderson has made clear in interviews, as of course I think it's a necessary prerequisite of being a Hollywood lovey, isn't it? That you have to make clear that you're portraying someone whose politics you personally disagree with and aren't a fan of. Do you think that comes across in the portrayal?
I have to say that, first of all, that the picture of Mrs. Thatcher that's presented is of a woman considerably older than she was at the time. This is partly perhaps a feature of the makeup, which she's slightly Mekong-like, Gillian Anderson, in that particular picture you have up now. But Mrs. Thatcher, she was 55, and 55 is not the appearance of the woman there. She looks somewhat more like 65. When I saw this, first of all, I was very struck by the fact that it reminded me of the Mrs. Thatcher of I would say, something like 2004, 2006. It's quite hard to get these things right. I don't think that either Miss Anderson or the producers of the show get her portrait as right as Meryl Streep did in The Iron Lady. I think if you look at The Iron Lady, you see two Margaret Thatchers. You see the elderly one, a little old lady pottering around, not remembering things very well, having very sad, nostalgic flashbacks, and the woman in charge, dominating, powerful, crisp, authoritative, and somewhat unfair to her male colleagues. Those pictures, the physical impression that Miss Streep gave in both those roles, two quite different impressions, seemed to me to be absolutely accurate. And I remember Mrs. Thatcher of the kind of Boadicea dominant female very well. I mean, I worked for her. And she was, in private, of course, she was absolutely charming and friendly. We'll get on to that slightly in a minute. But if you remember the scenes in which Mrs. Thatcher is walking briskly through the corridors of the House of Commons with these sort of feeble men trailing behind her, protesting vainly, you get an idea. Here was Boadicea dragging captives behind her chariot. And I think that kind of picture of Mrs. Thatcher, obviously overdrawn, was an accurate one in the Iron Lady movie. And Meryl Streep carried it off perfectly. I saw the film only a matter of months, I think, after I recently had several meetings with Mrs. Thatcher, and I was astonished at how accurately she had caught the old Mrs. Thatcher. Astonished. It was a brilliant performance. Now, on an important point, both movies, both The Queen Now and The Iron Lady, did, I think, have a theory of Mrs. Thatcher that was wrong. But it didn't matter. The theory was that, yes, she was in many respects a brave, bold, and powerful leader who accomplished a great deal. That's more in the Meryl Streep movie. But the argument of the film was, yes, but those things could have been accomplished far more easily and with much less storm and drang and stress if they'd been approached in a more convivial, not convivial exactly, congenial, soothing way. Well, by, for example, a lot of Blairite cabinet ministers gathering around a table. I think that is simply the worst kind of absurd sentimentality. It is desiring, you want what is the Greek expression? You want the palm without the dust. And the fact is, the idea that you could have a grave social crisis and dividing Britain, which was necessary to have to reform the country, you could have that without there being battles and rows and bitterness on both sides. That is simply the kind of sentimentality we can't help indulging it occasionally, but we should not take it seriously. So
revisionism.
Yeah, she's not the woman I saw in The Crown is not the woman I actually met on any number of occasions when I was working for her. She was a much more normal person. Her conversation was not this string of ideological diktats. She spoke to you and to me and to others, and she would speak, to friends and friendly colleagues. She was congenial. She was concerned about people in general, but she was concerned about the people she was working with. If anybody was ill, she asked after them. She tried to persuade somebody who was getting a divorce to go off and rest and relax. So it was going to be difficult. She urged Douglas Hurd on one occasion, I think, to take a vacation because he seemed to her to be overworked. She was attentive to people. She was, of course, in a general sense, a blend of two important things. She was, on the one hand, a towering world historical statesman, and that really is not what we see in the Queen. And secondly, she was an ordinary British housewife. And if you'd gone along there, let us say, Darren, given your age as the chairman of the local Young Conservatives, she would have been asking you if you were in a draft, had your bed been comfortable. She would have been pluffing up the cushions, asking you whether you'd like more cake, those kind of things. She was very much that sort of person. Everything she did, she in a sense took seriously, but also lightly. She could joke and was amusing about things. She didn't have a great sense of humor, but she had a strong wit and a good, clear mind. So she was good company.
The Crown tries to sort of draw out the class warfare elements, I would argue, and try and make out or imply that there was an obvious element of Mrs. Thatcher struggling to even so much as know what the right protocol is at any given moment, especially at Balmoral. One episode at Balmoral where the Queen tells Thatcher that her blue suit will alert the stag, whilst they're stalking said stag, of their presence. She's then sent back to Balmoral to change. Now, in your view, would a woman who famously had a love of fashion, especially British fashion, really not have known that she'd not packed the right clothes for Balmoral?
I would say everybody makes that kind of faux pas from time to time, or is put in the situation in which they made to feel uncomfortable. That's the impression you get from what happened in the Balmoral scenes. I'm not suggesting it happened in real life. H.G. Wells, the great writer actually, a man of the left, once complained bitterly of the assumption of people that a man who had been born in a poor and humble background, but who had nonetheless managed to rise to the heights of society, wouldn't have the kind of nous to know which fork to use in a meal. when eating a several-course dinner. And in fact, of course, not only would he know which fork to use, but if he didn't, for whatever reason, he would have no difficulty about asking the person next to him. So, I mean, I think that kind of portrait of her is a hostile, nasty one, not found based on reality, but based on what's an interesting social prejudice here. You may remember that about in the middle 1980s, the Sunday Telegraph ran a marvelous article by one of their star writers, previously with the BBC. And it was a series of interviews with heads of Oxford colleges and reading playwrights and so on, in which they discussed Mrs. Thatcher as a kind of social being. And I remember Dame Mary Warnock saying, what I can't stand is her odious suburban gentility. Well, first of all, suburban gentility may occasionally open you to mockery, but it's not odious. And when these comments were published, I think Jonathan Miller said something very silly as well. When they were published, the people who'd said them were within a few minutes made to feel themselves horribly embarrassed and out of place, because they'd given vent to the most snobbish prejudices, which until they'd appeared in print, they hadn't realized the extent to which they'd held them and expressed them themselves. So I think that, I feel that the people who made the Queen, and it's a brilliant series in many respects, when they look at, in a couple of years, when they may be embarrassed at the degree to which their social prejudices are on display, rather than Mrs. Thatcher's possible faux pas.
Yeah, because, in The Crown, again in that Balmoral scene, Mrs. Thatcher dresses for dinner and they enter the drawing room at 6 p.m. only to find that the royal party, recently down from walking in the hill, are still having tea, and 6 p.m. is far too early to be dressed for dinner. Now, I mean, Thatcher was born above the shop, but attempts to sort of highlight the class divide to this extent are a bit overblown, right? The importance of her humble beginnings are brought home quite forcefully. But I mean, just how important do you think, do you agree that that's somewhat overblown to suggest that she wouldn't have known that to come downstairs at 6 p.m. for tea, the royal family, having just been out for a walk, for example, wouldn't be dressed for dinner, that sort of silly thing. But also, how important was her class, her gender, and being a natural outsider?
Well, first of all, Mrs. Thatcher was very down to earth. And I think she would have reacted in exactly the same way, though perhaps not quite as wittily, as Noel Coward did when he was invited to a literary party in the 20s after some of his great successes. Went, as the form was, in the formal white tie and tails, not knowing that at this particular dinner party, they always dressed in casual clothes and so on. When he entered the room to find all these people in tweeds looking at him aghast, he stopped and said, "Now, I don't want anyone here to feel the slightest bit underdressed." And, that showed a confidence and changed the atmosphere. Mrs. Thatcher was perfectly capable of doing the same thing in a slightly different way, but simply acknowledging an error, if there was one, and then going on. Now, the more important aspect of your question about social class, think of the prince in Machiavelli's vision here. The prince does not have social prejudices that prevent him favoring or attacking people because of their social class. Mrs. Thatcher obviously might, in a private sense, have liked one class for another. I think she was quite a romantic. She was a big fan of movies in the 1930s with their romantic scenes and glamorous scenes. They were important for her imagination. But she wouldn't have allowed any particular feeling of admiration for a particular class or contempt for a particular class to determine what she did and how she acted politically. She would have just regarded those aristocrats who were on her side as jolly good chaps, finest, best people we can in Britain, people we need to rely on. And aristocrats who were against her, people who are out of touch, second rate, living in the past. She would have taken either view, depending on what the aristocrat was doing for her or how helpful he was going to be to her. So I think it's a mistake to think of her as being actuated in politics by class prejudice. I think in a general sense, when she used phrases like our people, she meant simply people on our side. And she wanted
the wets versus the dries, that was the divide, yeah?
Social groups who voted for us, or always were on, could be relied upon, they were the first, and then next to them, the people who could be persuaded to join our side by the policies and by rhetoric and argument. And she wanted to expand the classes which were on her side, and she wanted to dilute the classes which were not on her side. So I think Mrs. Thatcher did have some romantic feelings about the aristocracy, actually, the opposite to those in the Queen, where you see her becoming resentful about them. But she was well aware that some conservative leaders over a long period of time had decided that in a way Britain was declining, and the best thing we could do is manage its decline in as orderly and decent a way as possible. And she not only saw clearly that that was a mistake, but she pursued the policies they opposed, and she proved that their views were a mistake. They would never have taken on the battles of the 80s, from the Falklands to the miners' strike, let alone won them, as she did.
Now, Peter Morgan, the writer, has, in one scene, he has Mrs. Thatcher say to the Queen, as they sit down to discuss the first cabinet, that she doesn't believe women are right for office. Now, for high office, sorry. Do you think that she did think this? I mean, this is clearly an attempt at irony, but the Queen sort of raises an eyebrow. Do you think that is beyond just pure irony?
No. I mean, I think, for example, Mrs. Thatcher didn't go out of her way to try to help women in politics. She felt that no one had gone out of their way to help her. By the way, that's not entirely true. One of the interesting things about Mrs. Thatcher's early political life is the way in which the senior figures, men in the Conservative Party, realized we've got a political star here and we've got to do our best to promote her. And this is recognized even by her opponents. You remember the moment in which they're discussing whether to admit Mrs. Thatcher into the shadow cabinet. And I think, yes, Ted Heath says about Willie Whitelaw, he says, the problem is that if we let her in, we'll never be able to get rid of her, which turned out to be all too true. She got rid of him. But having said that, she didn't, I think she just took the view that at that point in politics, there weren't that many leading women. I mean, she didn't think that about in a general sense. I mean, she had great admiration for the women scientists she'd worked with at Oxford. They, of course, rated her as mediocre and didn't realize, some of them later said, they didn't realize that they kept her out, really, because she was on the right, which they thought was unimaginably, how could you be on the right? And therefore they, in a way, treated her badly. I think it's important we should look at Mrs. Thatcher's time at Oxford. She's a lively, aggressive, fun-loving woman. She doesn't have, I think, the best of times at Oxford. But she did have a good time in Oxford politics. And I think that Mrs. Thatcher's general kind of feelings about social life were she felt very confident when she's in a political setting, in a debate or in a committee meeting. She knows she can hold her own. She knows that she can win the arguments. she's less confident in a purely social setting, a cocktail party or whatever, where the conversation isn't a political conversation. I think that's true of quite a lot of people from not grand backgrounds. When they enter the world of politics and the world of high affairs in the late adolescence and early 20s, they have to develop social self-confidence, but already developed political self-confidence in their arguments across the dinner table with their own families.
Yes.
So, and I think that's a big difference. In her case, it took a relatively short time. I think once her emotional life got in order and married Dennis, she then became a formidable social figure as well as a formidable political one.
And of course, her father was very, very much at the heart of her entire philosophy, worldview, her values, but also her debating skills and speechwriting skills, indeed. Obviously helped by you. But another scene has Michael Fagan, who famously or infamously managed to break into Buckingham Palace and get into Her Majesty the Queen's bedroom, indeed. And in it, it's somewhat with creative license, I think it's safe to say, have Mr. Fagan talking to Her Majesty the Queen as she lay nervously in bed. And I think, as far as my viewing of the series is concerned, it was the first attempt at highlighting divides within society at that time. And the Queen, after this event, is seen in conversation with Mrs. Thatcher, or Gillian Anderson, and the security after that security breach. And the infamous line comes out, "There's no such thing as society." Now, I would just like you to sort of explain to us what it was that Mrs. Thatcher actually said here, because obviously the conversation about Mr. Fagan is entirely irrelevant, but the society line is a source of much debate and contention, but also taken entirely out of context. Have I got that right?
You have got it right. It's taken from one context and put in another. And secondly, there's a word inserted into that sentence which I cannot recall at the moment, but which even distorts it even further. Now, Mrs. Thatcher originally made that remark in a speech to the Church of Scotland. Originally had made a speech at the Church of Scotland, and she's being asked about these things in an interview with, I think, Woman's Own. And in that interview, she says there is no such thing as society. Society is you and me and our families, and we have an obligation, first of all, to provide security and stability for ourselves, and then from that standpoint, go out and help other people who haven't succeeded in doing so. Now, what she's saying here is that society is not some abstract entity out there, separate from our soul, from which we hope manna will flow down. What it is society is, of course, composed of the people who live in the society and in the institutions that they form in the society. And she's actually arguing for the idea of, first of all, what Shelley and Letwin called the vigorous virtues, prudence, sobriety, strong work ethic, a desire and success in saving and investing. And she's saying the vigorous virtues are the ones that we use to shape ourselves. And when we've succeeded in doing so to a considerable extent, we never fully succeed in establishing ourselves in a solid, completely kind of deaf to all temptation way. We'll always have weaknesses, but if we manage to establish ourselves as a stable family unit, for example, then on the basis of the vigorous virtues, we then go out and practice the softer virtues towards people who haven't succeeded as we have done. Now that is a Christian message and a very powerful one. And one should also remember that Mrs. Thatcher started life as a Methodist, She didn't find it difficult to become an Anglican because, of course, Wesley himself, I think, believed he was an Anglican. It was seen not as a repudiation of Anglicanism. Methodism was not. So Mrs. Thatcher had a very strong Wesleyan mentality, I think. And her favourite remark, one of her favourite remarks, was Wesley's injunction: work all you can, save all you can, give all you can. And I think that that makes the link very firmly indeed between your success and help to other people. And that was what she was arguing in that speech. I think it was shamefully and quite deliberately misinterpreted by her enemies, including, I'm afraid, people in the churches. And I think that it was really, I was shocked when I found Christian, and including, I'm a Catholic priests and authorities who actually, it seemed to me, had been told very clearly what the truth was, but carried on telling the lie because it was politically convenient to them.
Absolutely. Now, the Crown also fails to make much of the trade union struggle, and I mentioned earlier we'd get onto this, and it was a real dividing point in society because you had this idea before Mrs. Thatcher came onto the scene that these state-owned monopolies could guarantee jobs for life. You know, you could spend your life building, I don't know, steel and extracting coal. And that all vanished within that 11-year period, or much of it anyway, leading to, for some to say that Mrs. Thatcher was a great radical and far from being a conservative. You know, you had the likes of Macmillan strongly coming out against what then became Thatcherism.
Yes, I mean, Macmillan had said she's selling the family silver.
Yeah.
I forget who replied. Yes, she's selling the family silver back to the family. And that, I think, was a very reasonable retort. Now, yes, of course, there are divisions in every society at all times. The Crown begins with one of the most important in the period we're talking about, which is the divisions in Ireland and the divisions they created in England on how to deal with Irish terrorism. And those continue today, really. And some of the decisions taken in the 80s have made matters worse. Ireland at the moment is facing a grave political and moral crisis. It's facing a situation in which it's all too likely that the next election, general election there, will bring about a Sinn Féin government that would mean a party that is still in hock, still controlled by a secret army, would take control of the institutions of the state and have access to the records of the police and intelligence agencies, in which presumably are the names of people who were informers towards about the terrorist activities of the Provisional IRA. I think that is a terrible situation, but it's one that the Irish politicians, and particularly the Irish or the South Dublin middle class, has brought down upon itself by first tolerating, then romanticizing the evil of the politics of the gun. And until Ireland repudiates that without any qualification, I think it will continue to be in trouble. So the problems in the Crown for England are real, but there are also problems for Ireland, and no doubt we may see later for Scotland, but particularly I think for Ireland. Now, so there was that other one. Now about the trade unions. Yes, it's perfectly true that there was there was a division between, on the one hand, the overmighty labour unions and the rest of society. But what Mrs. Thatcher realised, and what other people came to realise later, was that there was a division within the labour unions. Now, we had forgotten that. Back in the 60s, of course, we knew that the labour unions, in some cases, had been in effect taken over by people on the far left. Generally, in those days, communists, it might be Trotskyists now. Now, once that happened, the labour unions started acting as the agents of fundamentally anarchist or extreme political elements. Some didn't, of course, but some did. And it then we had to solve the question of how do we make sure that the labour unions are not run by extremists, but are receptive to the opinions of the great majority of their members. And that's what Mrs. Thatcher did. She introduced democracy of a secure kind into the labour movement. And then secondly, she introduced laws that meant that the rogue unions, under the control of extremists, could not simply disobey the law of society, that they would have to, they couldn't blockade a factory simply because the labour union didn't like what the factory was doing in some industrial dispute. And those two kinds of changes, giving the power back to the labour union members and installing the kind of laws that restrain illegal behaviour on everybody else, applying those laws to the trade unions. And that brought about, first of all, the rebellion of the extremists, which was the miners' strike. Oh, sure, there were lots of non-extremists who were on the shop floor or rather than down the pit and so on, but they were kept in place in some degree by intimidation and violence. It's no use, we now forget all of that, but it was clear at the time. And so that once the miners failed to win that strike, which they did because of careful organisation on the part of Mrs. Thatcher's government, by Mrs. Thatcher herself, but also by Nigel Lawson, we actually we restored completely constitutional government in Britain, and that began. We secured the space for consistent, sensible economic policy that defeated inflation and revived the economy. And we had, that was 1985, we had 23 years of sustained increases in prosperity. There was a blip because, against her will, Mrs. Thatcher was forced by colleague to enter the ERM, and that briefly paused.
The exchange rate mechanism.
23 years until the 2008 financial crash, in which Britain prospered. And the great thing was that this was important in world terms. Think of it this way. I'll stop there. The Soviet Union in 1985 had almost 70 years of a communist government that didn't have to worry about opposition or media criticism, but could pursue any policy it wanted. It left the Soviet Union and its satellites as economic wastelands. Mrs. Thatcher came to power in 1979. In the period we've just seen in The Crown, 81, 82, the worst impact of her policy, her economic policies were felt. But by 1985, 86, it was clear that Britain was now the fourth largest economy in the world, and it continued to thrive and prosper for the next 23 years. So that's the big picture. And that big picture is signally not present in the Crown.
Yes. And I wonder if you can just... Go on.
I'm just going to say I particularly like the portrayal of Princess Margaret, who appears in what is for her, in the movie, a very persuasive but an unusual historical view of her as the advocate of common sense and reality in dealing with people's emotions. And I couldn't help reflecting that her life had been sacrificed to the idea of duty, and it had been, in a sense, ruined in a way. But the rules had been kept. They couldn't be kept in Diana's case later, because society's rules were no longer enforced by society. Princess Margaret was the last case, I think. She was the last victim of that kind of respectability. And the social forces that made that possible had vanished by the time of Diana. And therefore, her Princess Margaret's view of that, be it her advice not to go ahead with the marriage, was not only, I think, emotionally the right attitude, as I think anyone would say, but also it showed a grasp of social change in society's moral expectations. And that's an important point in the film, which I think is handled well.
Now, Mrs. Thatcher, the writer, Mr. Morgan, suggests that after winning the first ballot in the leadership challenge of 1990 by 4 votes, colleagues say she has to go. Supportive colleagues say that she has to go for the good of the party and the country. They won't back her. And she's apparently, Mrs. Thatcher says to Dennis in the portrayal in The Crown, "No," she says to Dennis, "I still have one card to play." And it then transports us to Buckingham Palace with an audience with Her Majesty the Queen. And Mrs. Thatcher suggests proroguing Parliament. And this is silly. This is verging on the cartoon. The Queen, and I want your opinion on this, would never have intervened to save the neck of a Prime Minister who was losing a party's support. And of course, Mrs. Thatcher would never have thought about or dreamed about asking her to do so.
Well, first of all, it didn't happen, did it?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. Yeah.
It's not a historical event which they're retelling in an interesting way. It's an invention. Secondly, Mrs. Thatcher did intend, I think when she returned from the Paris Peace Conference, which was a ratification of her great historical achievement, along with Ronald Reagan, of winning the Cold War, she did return with the intention of fighting on. Why did she change her mind? Didn't change her mind because she met opposition from the palace. Palace, by that stage, whatever difficulties it may have had with her over welfare policy and riots, had come to admire her. The Queen, after all, gave her the Order of Merit. There is no higher award in the honours system in the United Kingdom. No, I mean, what happened was she was given bad advice. She was given the advice that she should talk to members of the cabinet. The view of Cecil Parkinson, one of her loyalists on that occasion, later on, Cecil was a good friend and we talked about it. He said, look, she should have said to the cabinet, "Gentlemen, I fight on. I imagine any one of you who doesn't want to support me will now resign. In the meanwhile, I'm going down to talk to the electorate. I'm going over to the Palace of Westminster and talk to members of Parliament, Tory members of Parliament." And I think she could have swayed a lot of people. Some of them had voted against her, in a sense, to rein her in, not intending that she should lose. Others basically were annoyed that she was cavorting around in Paris and not paying proper attention to them, and so on and so forth. And I think if she'd done that and simply said, I'm going to fight the election, I depend on your support. You've seen the great things we've accomplished. We don't need to go to the country for a couple of years yet. So I want your back. I think she would have won. And I think, by the way, the man who made them was Michael Heseltine. Because if Michael Heseltine had come out of that first ballot and said, I congratulate Mrs. Thatcher on defeating me in the first ballot. I know she hasn't reached the arbitrary limit which the rules of leadership impose on us, but a defeat is a defeat and a victory is a victory, and I recognize that. And I've just written to her to request that I be one of the people who sign her nomination papers for the second ballot. He would have been Prime Minister within 18 months. Mm-hmm. She would have bring him back into the cabinet. When she won the election, as she probably would have done, he would have been regarded, as to some extent Nigel Lawson was regarded in 1987 as the man who won the election. She would have remained in office for another 6 months and then retired, handing over through gritted teeth the palm to Michael Heseltine. But when you get that close to power, I think your prudential judgment deserts you. you can see it's too close. You can have it tomorrow. Why should I wait another 18 months? But of course, he didn't have it.
Yes. Now, in another scene, the Queen wants sanctions via the Commonwealth, and there's a supposed fight between Her Majesty the Queen and Margaret Thatcher over South Africa and how to best bring down apartheid. And Mrs. Thatcher is against sanctions, and there was, at the time, a lot of disagreement between Conservatives over how best you approach the South African issue. Now, Tim Stanley, the Telegraph columnist, has argued that it was, in his opinion, one of her biggest mistakes. But the implication that the Crown makes, though, is that she solely wanted to boost British business, including her son Mark's financial interests in South Africa. That's deeply unfair. You know, when you've got the likes of Nelson Mandela saying that his country had much to be thankful to Mrs. Thatcher for, who was deeply opposed to apartheid. I wonder if you'd any reflections on this side of the Crown.
Well, of course, yes. First of all, if you read Charles Moore, or if you read Robin Rennick's book, which is about his period as the British ambassador in Pretoria, and the work that he acted, the way he acted as the person who went between Downing Street, Nelson Mandela, and later F.W. de Klerk. She had been pressing strongly for changes that would bring about majority rule in a multiracial democracy in South Africa from the mid 80s. This was very active and engaged diplomacy, but it was not exactly secret diplomacy, but it was private diplomacy. She was exerting the strongest pressure on P.W. Botha and then on F.W. de Klerk to move in the right direction. She was in contact with Nelson Mandela. He later paid a tribute to her on this score, as you've said. And what was the difference? Why did things speed up towards the end of her time in office? I think it was simple. Until F.W. de Klerk got into power in his own right, Mrs. Thatcher didn't have a Gorbachev to negotiate with on the other side. F.W. de Klerk was that Gorbachev. And when he got in, he moved quickly to implement what was, among other things, the Thatcher agenda. Now, if I were going to criticize Mrs. Thatcher on Southern Africa, from a conservative standpoint, I would say that she didn't actually build enough safeguards into the transition to black majority rule and multiracial democracy. Things have not gone well. Things did not go well at all in Zimbabwe, and they're going quite seriously wrong at the moment in South Africa. But the fact is, you can only achieve in politics that which is practicable, and it wouldn't have been possible for her to actually pursue the active diplomacy to bring about multiracial democracy by, in a sense, attaching too many qualifications to it. Wouldn't have been supported by Mandela, wouldn't have been supported by others. Mandela himself, who obviously learned a great deal from his own experience and changed his mind on some key issues, he was probably too essential to the long-term success of South Africa. I hope I'm wrong about that, and the game is not over, but one has to be realistic. But nonetheless, the left's view of things and the BBC view of things and the international organization's view of things is that she was really acting in order to, in a sense, preserve British economic power in South Africa. That's absurd. And even her her opposition to sanctions, among other things, she was terribly opposed, for instance, to the strike of children in schools. She said, this is building trouble, really building up serious trouble for the future if we don't teach the people who will be the electorate in the future South Africa and some of the most powerful people in the government. If we don't teach them at this tender age, if they don't, when they're 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 to 15, we are building up trouble for that country. She was very, very strong on that. I think if I would listen to anyone on this, is not my area really, Charles Powell and Robin Rennick, they know what happened in detail. They would be very much worth talking to.
Yes. Now, the Crown also entirely skips over, and I promised we'd get to this, the Crown entirely skips over the Soviet Union. Now, you've argued the simultaneous presence of, in the highest offices in their respective countries, of Ronald Reagan, of Margaret Thatcher, and of Pope John Paul II. That was responsible ultimately for the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, could you, one, explain why you think perhaps, or if indeed you do think this, why it's a mistake of the Crown to just sort of brush this to one side, and why actually it really was a significant part of Thatcher's time in office, and how odd it is really to omit this from the series entirely?
Well, it's very hard to portray.
Yes, I guess that's right.
In that area as a failure. After all, the Cold War, and particularly the peaceful end of the Cold War and the defeat of communism, altogether these were an event of astounding importance in world history. They have changed everything. And I think that if you're going to admit that, and you can't deny that Mrs. Thatcher played a role first in building up the self-confidence and the defense strength of the West, and then secondly, having accomplished that and having blocked the installation of, helping to block the installation of Soviet missiles, in having defeated the left in Europe, the whole of the left, millions of people in the street. She helped to defeat their attempts to block the installation of American missiles in Western Europe, which were the counterpoint to the Soviet missiles pointed against us in Central and Eastern Europe. So effectively, once she'd accomplished that, in my view, that was when the Soviets couldn't win the Cold War. She then reached out to them and worked out with Gorbachev and others. First of all, she linked them to Reagan and convinced Reagan, I don't think he needed a lot of convincing, but still, that Gorbachev was a partner he could do business with. And then over a period of the next 4 years, we gradually installed a regime of peace in Europe, and the disarmament of the Soviet Union and eventually its breakup. So these were things which are so important that you can't deny their importance. You just look at idiots if you do. And then secondly, you can't deny her creative and important role. Reagan was the major figure. John Paul II was the major figure. I mean, I would put it this way. Pope showed the communist regime was profoundly immoral, but also spiritually weak. Reagan showed that in terms of both defense and self-confidence and morale, the Soviet Union was dying, whereas America was expanding and rediscovering its energy and idealism again. And Mrs. Thatcher demonstrated, as I was kind of arguing before, that free markets could revive an economy far more quickly and deeply than centralized command and control methods exercised from one or two rooms in the Kremlin. And Gorbachev himself, that was one of the things. He knew that, he discovered that. He complained once that, we made two interesting complaints. He complained that the Soviet Union was exporting less than Singapore. And when somebody said about the communism, when they said, well, the problem is that the bureaucrats seem to have private interests in the welfare state, and they pursue those rather than the benefit of the ordinary people. And Gorbachev said, yes, I'm afraid Parkinson's law applies everywhere. And that was an admission that really their system couldn't work. and he set out to reform it. But as John Paul said, Gorbachev is a good man, but communism is unreformable. It seems we have to learn that lesson, every 20 years.
What's your rating of the portrayal of Mrs. Thatcher in The Crown then out of 10?
Oh, I'm afraid I'd have to give it about 4. Yes. I mean, there is one moment in it which is interesting, and in which she repeats, this is a very simple line. It's about what we should do. And I can't remember the exact line now, but it's something like she says, oh, yes, that's right. Somebody says, well, we can do nothing. And she says something like, if we don't do something, then things will go on as they have. And something that's not it. She repeats it twice, something like, we must do something, because if we do nothing, we can't expect things to get better. And that is a Thatcher moment. Well, thank you, Darren. In matter of fact, I will have a book of essays out in about 3 or 4 months. So people can buy that. That's a way of showing their gratitude to me if they feel any. And in the meantime, they can always go back and buy my book on the President, the Pope, and the Prime Minister, which is still available on Amazon and elsewhere. So
definitely, thank you. We'll have to discuss your essays as well when you've finally released that.
Good. Thank you very much.
No,
thank you.
Okay, take care. Now, I'm sure you'll be absolutely desperate to hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. We're also over halfway to securing our fundraising target, so click that link in the description and support us if you're in a position to do so. I'll see you next time.